Hello, and welcome to another faction guide for Divide at Impera, the mod for Rome 2 Total War. Today we're going to be covering a fan favorite, the Seleucid Empire. They are the largest faction at the beginning of the campaign, and subsequently they have the greatest technology at the beginning, some of the best units in the game right from the onset from turn 1, but also a rather challenging start position. Not because you have this apocalyptic scenario like Syracuse when you're being attacked from all sides by all sorts of larger factions, but rather because your start position is just very, very complex. You have a lot of very challenging decisions to make from the onset of the campaign, which will dictate whether you end up conquering your foes or whether you end up being overwhelmed and succumb to a very slow death by 1,000 cuts. So without further ado, let's get right into the campaign map and figure out how we can navigate the rather complex start position that the Seleucids have. Alright everybody, so this is the dreaded, or sometimes revered, depending upon your perspective, Seleucid start position. And as you can see, you start out with a massive amount of territory. Nearly 3 entire provinces under your control from turn 1. This is by far the most land-rich nation you could possibly play as in Rome 2. Even the Ptolemies, who possessed Yehuda, Egyptus, and then some of Libya, have less total settlements for the Seleucids, I believe. However, their settlements are kind of on the edge of the map. They're relatively safe, rather insulated settlements compared to that of the Seleucids, who are smack dab in the middle of many factions. There are Arab raiders right here in Magna, Arabia Magna, and Nabatea. The Ptolemies lie right on your doorstep right here, and they are quite vengeful for the wars that you fought earlier, so they will commit to combat quite quickly. During all of my tests as the Seleucids, the Ptolemies declared war near instantaneously, maybe turn 1, maybe turn 2. Perhaps if they're being particularly careful, they'll wait till turn 3, but no longer than that, guys. So fully expect and appreciate the fact that you will be at war with the Ptolemies quite quickly. However, they aren't an imminent threat despite that. They are a little bit lethargic. You know, perhaps you can say they aren't the most competent administrators militarily in the world. And what they'll do is they'll declare war on you, but you'll weirdly not see any armies on your border immediately after. And they'll kind of just make a new army in Jerusalem or Tyros or something and just make that army from scratch. So even though they will declare war quite quickly, it usually isn't really a huge threat to you for 8 turns or 9 turns. You know, the Ptolemies, it kind of takes a while for them to muster their strengths and actually get to your border. And that's kind of the way that big empires are at the end of the day, right? They aren't the quickest beasts to move, the quickest states to move or do something. So you have a little bit of time, and that time is going to give you a chance to kind of figure out what it is that you're going to do. You see, as the Seleucids, you start out with a lot of territory, but it's almost too much territory, because you also start out with a standard 21,000 denarii that any faction does. This means that a faction like Colchis, or a faction like Massalia, or something like that, will start out with the same number of, the same amount of money that you do, despite you having so many things to spend money on. I mean, you obviously need to upgrade all the buildings in Syria, and you need to do that similarly to your second large province, Mesopotamia. I mean, both of these provinces are expanding in terms of population. In fact, so is Palmyra over here. So guys, you have 3 provinces that want to expand, while simultaneously you might want to destroy some buildings. Like, for example, Palmyra absolutely doesn't need a barrack. You might want to make a public order related building here. Over here in Syria, you might want to try to get a little bit more food resources going. You might want to upgrade this farm. You might want to get, you know, a fishing port over here. You might want to upgrade to level 2 barrack over here to unlock some units potentially. I mean, you obviously have great investments to make, and we haven't even started about talking about our armies, which obviously need to be fully formed. So considering how much territory you have to control, you don't really have the resources to quickly get everything you need done. You're going to have to win a couple of turns of respite to properly start building these provinces up, yet you might not have that as the Seleucids because your diplomatic situation is precarious. Now, I already covered, but the Ptolemies will inevitably declare war on you. It's pretty much scripted. Like the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they will fight until only one is left standing. It's a continuation of the wars of the Diadochi, and I'm all here for it. I believe that you as the Seleucids have a better army, turn one. In fact, I know that you do, because a Ptolemaic roster until the Pharos reforms is very flawed. But what I can tell you, quite explicitly, is that the Ptolemies don't really have a whole lot else to focus on. Like, they can just send whatever armies from Egypt that they need and deploy them against you, while you might have other opponents, potentially. Now, in Syria, this is basically your best province right from the beginning. I mean, none of your provinces are particularly Hellenized, but at least Syria has a 30% Hellenic population. Besides that, it's the most easily defensible because it's kind of here against the Mediterranean, so at the very least, you won't be completely surrounded like Mesopotamia, which will be hard to hold. So you really want Syria to become your most stable region and kind of the core, the heart of your empire. Yet you're not even fully in control of it. Samosata, the last settlement, is under the control of the Armenians. You also happen to have a non-aggression pact with the Armenians, as you can see here, and subsequently they'd happily extend that to a trade agreement if you wish, so you can court good relations with the Syrians. And that will of course give you the option to fight the Ptolemies and maybe some eastern factions a little bit more if you'd like. However, you do have a lot to gain from war with the Armenians, so that's kind of one decision you have to make right from the beginning. Am I going to go and take the Armenians on and annex Samosata, but of course get into a war with a pretty powerful faction, one in possession of like an entire sprawling, well-populated province here? Now, the other opponent that you have to consider right from the onset is Astrapakan. And the way I would kind of consider this historically is that, you know, the Persians are divided after Alexander the Great's conquest. The majority of Persians are satraps under the Seleucids, as Alexander and the Seleucids did conquer quite extensively. However, some of these satraps have broken away, mainly the Parthians, who are kind of a Iranian nomadic people that are new on the scene, and of course Astrapakan, which are more from like the Persian heartland. And these ex-satraps, who have been also rebellious and successful, they will pretty quickly start to declare war on you and your satraps as the Seleucids. Speaking of that, you have satraps. You have satraps up the wazoo. They don't like you. They're all hostile. Despite a satrapy more or less being like a servant of some sort, they just don't really like you. You can see over here, these guys are hostile. Here in Havaria, you can see that these guys, Lydia, they're actually happy, but they're only Greek satraps, so that makes sense. There's cultural affinity there. Parsa, this is basically like Persia proper. These guys don't like you. Parchava, they don't like you either. And they will eventually rebel against you. It's scripted, guys. They will eventually rebel, and you'll be at war with all of them when you do. Now, one way that you can kind of short-circuit this particular problem is you can actually just go into here and you can just cancel a satrap. I mean, it will decay your reliability. However, it means that if your satraps revolt, if you get that notification, that kind of like an event, it's like the Punic Wars. It happens, guys. It's scripted. It occurs on a random turn every campaign, so I can't tell you when, but you know, they will ultimately do so. But what I kind of wanted to get here, as a sort of, how would I put this?
The trade tab details all resources
As a sort of
and shows whether they are exported.
Advice to you guys is that the satraps, they will eventually break away. However, they also bring in a lot of money. I mean, I can show you guys right here. This is 2,300 coming in from your satrapies, and I just broke one of the satrap agreements too. So a huge amount of your early game income is completely dependent on maintaining your satrapies, while simultaneously you're basically a ticking time bomb. They don't want to pay you that money. I mean, you can see it's quite an extensive amount. It's quite a bulky amount. So you will eventually have to face them in battle if you keep them, yet you want to keep them as long as possible. So that's the other thing, guys. You're kind of playing a game of Russian roulette every time that you hit the end turn button. And if you break your satrapy agreements, you end the game of Russian roulette. However, at the same time, they will inevitably declare war on you. So you're gambling. You're gambling with your empire's future. And to find yourself at war with all of these factions, like boom, 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 boom. All of these guys, boom, all of these guys. The Lydians up here too. To find yourself at war with basically like half the map is quite tiresome. It's quite bad. So you just have to consider whether you want to cut those satraps loose or if you want to keep them. Ultimately, there's no way you can keep them forever though, so keep that in mind. So yeah, I've also kind of portrayed what your main opponents are going to be. The Armenians are potentially there, although you can hold off from being at war from them for quite a while just because of a non-aggression pact. So mind that, while there is probably no greater advantage you can have from going to war with a faction, like inevitably you will take Samosata, it might be worth it to hold on just to have an easier and more peaceful early game. Astrapakan will probably be a faction that you're at war with too, and the Ptolemies, that's 100% guaranteed. Now when it comes to your early game roster, you do have really good recruitment capacity, particularly here in Syria, because Antioch is just the coolest building when it comes to recruitment. I mean, for one, they give you the most cracked garrisons possible, but two, your level 1 Antioch building gives you early Royal Guard cavalry, which is basically a jacked up companion cavalry. Just an absolutely amazing unit to have on turn 1. They also give you Seleucid hoplites right from turn 1. And once you get to level 3, this is where you can recruit your Syrian war elephants, who are absolute tanks. Syrian archers, who are, you know, a very well armored yet skillful archer, although not the best in melee combat. And your Silver Shield pikemen, who are an elite pike unit that'll serve you exquisitely well. Great morale, really high attack for a pikeman, just a pikeman of excellent combat stats, yet these guys come from your second population class rather than your first. So they essentially have the statistics of elite pikemen, but kinda would typically come from your nobility, yet they're coming from your second class population. So they're just as easy to recruit as regular pikemen, they just cost more money. So you're going to have amazing military recruitment in Syria if you play your cards right and just train the proper troops. But even from turn 1, look at all you have. I mean, you have great cavalry options. You have your noble cav, you have a 90-person light cav, which is actually a medium in mass cavalry, yet it has 8 speed. Not the best armor, nor the best combat stats in the world on this, yet 54 armor still makes these guys quite competent. And they're still a little bit cheaper than your citizens, who have less men, although they're just more defensively capable, they'll live for longer. You have your Sarissa Lancers, which are absolutely just a glass cannon, but 63 charge bonus is absolutely obscene. And with 90 men and 8 speed, these guys absolutely have a purpose of just being just phenomenal against enemy skirmishers, as well as great for hammer and anvil too. Just this unit will kind of suck against enemy cavalry. You have the best base pikemen in the game. I mean, it's not like these guys are exclusive to Seleucids. The Epirodes and the Macedonians also have them, but these guys are great. And you know, you can go hoplites if you want to, light hoplites, Greek infantry, just an assortment that will make an absolutely competent army between great cavalry and great phalanxes, although your skirmishers and light infantry leave something to be desired. And really, when it comes to your Seleucid start, you really just have to do what you have to do. Like, you can go anywhere that you want. You have an immense amount of freedom, but simultaneously, you're going to be a little bit reactive here. Because as I mentioned before, it's going to be very, very expensive for you to get all of the buildings that you need and recruit the armies that you need to defend such a large amount of territory. So if I were you, I wouldn't declare war on anybody right from the onset. See who's going to declare war against you. Slowly build up your armies. Like, maybe, like, say in this army, if you're going to go for archers or skirmishers, just kind of, like, get your archers, start getting a couple of your more, like, supportive units in line, like, don't immediately start recruiting your phalanxes or whatever, and then once someone declares war on you nearby, you can just quickly finish off your army, since you have so many settlements in each province. It'll be pretty easy and quick for you to just fully spam out an army. And if you keep it cheap like this, your income will stay high, you'll keep on raking it in, and you'll get the income to actually properly build up your province as you need to do. I mean, building up a singular province is gonna like drain the vast majority of your income. So, you know, consider that. Now, of course, when it comes to your Seleucid expansion, you can go in several directions, but you can't really go everywhere all at once. So it's really up to you whether you want to kind of take the north of Syria and then expand into Asia Minor, maybe reclaim the Pontus, as, you know, the Seleucids had control of Asia Minor at one point, but it was lost to them in satrap revolts. You, of course, could go down south and conquer the all-important and extraordinarily wealthy provinces of Egypt. That would be a great option for you too. But I can tell you, if you go north or if you go south, you're most likely going to neglect the east. That's kind of an inevitability when you do such a thing, particularly because, as you can see, Mesopotamia is just really, really open and surrounded. Like, there's Armenians to the north of Edessa, to the south of Hatra, there's Arabs, to the south of Seleucia, Arabs, of course, as well as the Mauryaans are somewhat within striking distance at some point. And of course, all of your satraps, which may eventually turn to you, are also right here on the border as well. And Ashurbanipal Khan could go cross the mountains and get into Seleucia and Hatra and Edessa and all that. So you just have so many enemies here, but it only takes one of them invading for this entire province to be thrown into chaos. And if the majority of your funds are being consumed by armies that are fighting down here or up here, then, you know, it's going to be really, really hard to defend this amazingly vast swath of territory. I mean, this is like Scythia in terms of distance between north and south. So be prepared to potentially lose Mesopotamia. That is what tends to happen when it comes to the Seleucids. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but it's really hard to prioritize something else and still maintain control of Mesopotamia, yet Syria is infinitely defensible. Now, also, don't sleep on Palmyra. It is a province where you have very few Greeks living there, so if you just don't invest at all, like you just ignore this province, as instinct would probably have you do. I mean, this is by far your least valuable province of all of them. Yet if you do, it'll probably end up being rebellious, or it'll probably get attacked by the Nabateans, who, you know, they're by far the most organized of these Arab kingdoms. And if that happens, then, you know, there's going to be Arabs ready to strike at your Syrian heartland. So I wouldn't abandon Palmyra, but it's also very hard to have your head in the game when it comes to Palmyra when the rest of your empire is going down the drain. So that's kind of my summary of what you have to do. Going to war against Armenia makes sense, however, because you're going to have so many other potential enemies, you might just want to hold off despite the rewards of taking Samosata. The Ptolemies will be at war with you quite quickly. It will take them a little bit longer to actually muster an army to attack you, so you have some time, but beware, it's an inevitability, and they will definitely cross into Syria if you don't cross into Yehuda first. I would strike the first blow and make a strong army in Syria as your first Seleucid army in the field. Mesopotamia is a vast and very wealthy province. However, you're surrounded by potential troublemakers, both from the south of Arab factions and the north of Armenians and Persians. To the east, you have your satraps, who are also unreliable and inevitably will rebel. So you just have to consider how you wish to hold Mesopotamia, whether you want to invest a considerable amount of resources to hold it, or whether it's just a buffer to build up Syria and maybe capture Yehuda and Egypt, and really just cling a lot closer to the Mediterranean, which would strategically make a lot of sense. Now let's go look at the factional buffs and debuffs, and of course get into the almighty Seleucid military. Now, the Seleucids' buffs and debuffs are honestly quite strong. In fact, I would claim that of all factions, the Seleucids have some of the better ones that are out there, although one particular debuff, well, the only debuff they have, is very disadvantageous considering how many satraps they have. Now, when it comes to all the Diadochi factions, or the successor kingdoms as they're more commonly called, you get minus 20% resistance to foreign occupation. And as you can see, there's a Seleucid exclusive buff that also decreases foreign culture public order penalties. So collectively, that minus 20% plus this, they'll kind of combine together to create the ultimate minus resistance to foreign occupation, which is really, really good considering that you're most likely going to be conquering lands that are dominated by foreigners, you know, and all of your provinces start dominated by foreigners. These two buffs are very, 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 very strong. Of course, there's no real strategy to using them. It's gonna facilitate a much easier time for you when it comes to conquering other provinces, when it comes to taking over the settlements of the Ptolemies, who are, for not majority Greeks, at least not at the beginning of the game. When you conquer Persian kingdoms or Arab kingdoms or Galatian territory, whatever it might be, there's not going to be a ton of Greek-dominated territory anywhere near you until you get to the very, very tip of Anatolia with Asia, the province with Rhodes and with Pergamon and stuff like that, and Lydia. So you're quite far away from any Greek-dominated territory, so this is going to be very useful. Now, plus 10% morale for all units during battles against Hellenic factions, that's kind of useful, but not really, particularly because the Ptolemies will also get that buff, so, the Ptolemies are your main Hellenic opponent, so it won't really help you a ton against those, but it will ensure that you do have an advantage against the Pergames, and of course against Rhodes, so I guess it will have some sort of advantage. Of course, if you decide to invade Greece, it'll help you out against Athens and Sparta, but I would say it's kind of not the most important buff for the Seleucids to have. You also do get increased agricultural income, which is great. I mean, every single playthrough involves making some agricultural buildings, and this is just going to help you improve your agricultural economy throughout the game, so absolutely wonderful. But this major diplomatic penalty of all Persian factions is obviously a massive problem, especially considering that Parthia will inevitably become a great power to the east, and this debuff, which is pretty strong, it's like minus 40, it's really major, like underline the major here. This will ensure that you inevitably find yourself at war with Parthia once they get large enough. Same thing with your satraps. This will guarantee that they will eventually betray you. It's basically impossible to have great long-term relations with them. This also will probably make sure Astrapok Khan attacks you pretty early on too. They'll love poking around at your Mesopotamian territories. So keep in mind that this is just going to guarantee that your eastern flank is constantly in peril, as every Persian faction will covet your lands. But of course, the Arabs to the south as well as the Armenians to the north will not be affected by this. So at least with those types of people, you still have a chance, but with the Persians, you absolutely won't. Now, let's go and look at the Seleucid roster, because they are quite powerful. So this is the Seleucid roster, and I'm going to say right from the onset that they dominate in the phalanx department as well as the cavalry department. However, they do have some glaring weaknesses. This is by no means your all-inclusive faction that's going to be powerful in every regard. I mean, you can see right here that their missile infantry actually is very, very limited. In fact, it's about as generic as humanly possible for a Greek faction. Like, you can't get more limited than this. Otherwise, their melee infantry is not excellent, so I'll be completely honest with you. They do have some great options considering that they're a Hellenic faction, but it's within the scope of what Greek factions tend to provide, compared to a good barbarian faction, compared to the Romans, compared to a good Iberian faction, compared to really, any faction where melee infantry will be the focus of their military development. The Seleucids are rather mediocre compared to them. So you do have to qualify that, but regardless, I kind of compare factions against the others in their cultural groups. So at the end of the day, when it comes to Greek factions, the Seleucids are an absolute powerhouse, and they just have so many great tools at your disposal. You can absolutely win and dominate battles and wars with these guys. So let's just get right into it with the generals, of which you have many options, although a lot of these are kind of the contrast between early and late games. So you have to consider that. Now, your first general here is the Seleucid Royal Guard, and I do have to point out that this is a 4x unit, so you won't have them for the first 120 turns. Even more potentially, depending on your Imperium. But regardless, you have to wait till the 4x reforms to get these guys, and this is a tank. It's basically a 4x, a 4x spear on steroids. And in Divide et Impera, 4x spears are pretty good. Like, they are humongous tanks. Like, they don't kill the most. However, they absorb just so much punishment, so much pain. A 4x spear can kind of just sit in the midst of combat in a square formation or in a shield wall and just endure and endure and endure and endure. The vast majority of 4X spearmen are rather generic. However, this one is just a buffed out version of that. Like more attack, more melee defense, I think more charge bonus too, more like literally more of everything. I think besides armor penetration with some kind of stats that don't move like that. But this is just a way better version of the 4X spear. I know that this is equivalent to the Per Demise 4X spear. They also have like more armor, and then the Bosphorus Kingdom, they have another elite 4X spear. I believe that theirs has less combat stats, but they actually have a volley of javelins as well as more armor. But this one is just better at fighting. So the Seleucid Royal Guard is a great unit to have, but mind you, it's highly defensive. This is not the type of unit that you throw into the fray and hope that they kill manically and quickly. No, this is a very, very calculated, very tanky unit. Of course, it's great because in a place with great skirmishers, right? Just all the Arab and Persian factions will try to skirmish you to death. It's really good to have like a unit with really good shields and 41 armor and, you know, great melee defense too. These guys will be able to resist the onslaught of arrows and javelins that your opponents throw at you. So it's a useful unit for sure. Now the shield bearers, this is one of the best hoplites in the game. This is one of the best hoplites in the game because your typical elite hoplite will have the same stats as here, but instead of 41 armor, they will have 38. And also, this is a very heavy phalanx, while the other ones are typically just heavy phalanxes. So this is just a really, really good unit. Macedon also gets access to this unit. And besides reformed Spartan hoplites, which have better attack stats and better movement speed, but don't have the same level of armor, there's really nothing that can compete against these guys. So if you like hoplites, this is just an absolutely elite example of a hoplite. Very little can beat this other than like a 225 person hoplite from Macedon or Sparta. So highly recommend that you bring them. And considering your weak melee infantry, this is actually a great unit to potentially put on the flanks earlier in the campaign. You know, supported of course by some of your weaker melee and spear options, but these guys will just add so much class, so much power to your flank defenses that'll just allow your phalanxes to thrive. Now moving on to your cavalry generals, some of these are late game units like this late Royal Guard cavalry. You know, these guys are only available post 4X, I believe. But your Greek companions, actually I'm unsure. I believe that these guys are also late game if I'm not mistaken. I believe that they are. Well, regardless, I mean, these guys have the exact same combat stats as your early Royal Guard cavalry, but yet I think the Greek companions are definitely late game because there has to be a contrast between companions and Greek companions. So yeah, I believe that this is more of like a late game unit, but regardless guys, doesn't really matter. These guys all kind of serve the same purpose with the exception of the late Royal Guards, which are a cataphract unit. These three units are very quick, although this companion cavalry, these guys have 7 speeds. So they're the quickest. However, your early Royal Guard, which you can also recruit, although will cost more money, will have better combat stats and better charge. I honestly just recommend that you go for the early Royal Guard cavalry. I feel like the more powerful your general is, the better it is for you. Why would you try to save money on your general unit? That just doesn't make any sense. Your general is probably the most valuable unit in your army, so you might as well just put him in the best bodyguard possible. And you know, you want your extra units that you recruit to be the ones that have additional speed, so you can kind of maneuver them around and do risky things with them. Your general, keep them in a better unit. Now once you get the 4X reforms, because this Greek companion is nothing special, literally the same stats as your early Royal Guard, so like why would I care? This is just a late game variation of this unit, so like in late game you can still go for your typical companion style cab. And to be honest, like Just because you have cataphracts doesn't mean you need cataphracts. I just want to make that very clear. Cataphracts are a very specific instrument of war because they move very slowly. While they do absolutely obliterate in melee combat over time and have a ferocious charge, they're also exceptionally vulnerable. They can get bogged down in infantry and easily torn away. They can easily get bogged down in a sea of faster cavalry and have no means of escape. Will just have to fight to the death, and they will die. They're not invincible. Cataphracts also get annihilated by skirmish fire, despite their heavy armor. They're just such huge, bulky targets. Impossible to miss, that type of thing. And if you're getting chased by like skirmish cavalry and you have no support, well, let's get destroyed. Or we'll just get targeted by every archer or javelin unit if you just charge them in gung-ho with no support. So guys, I'm just saying, but the companion cavalry is a lot more maneuverable, a lot more flexible, while simultaneously still being very powerful. So if you have companions, they're kind of a standalone unit, which they'll win battles for you. They're a decisive instrument of war. If you get a hammer and anvil with them, your enemies go screaming off the battlefield. But your cataphracts, you need to basically base your game plan around if you have these guys, because you can't send them in alone. They're just too slow. These guys are much more vulnerable than their 56 armor implies. But going back to the companion, like these guys are good for late game if you want a more flexible unit. Your late Royal Guard cavalry, these guys are an insane cataphract unit. You have regular cataphracts, which aren't that good, but this Royal Guard cavalry is insane. I was testing them out in the off game, and these guys will defeat elite melee cav. I'm talking about like really good melee cavalry, like Getic Royal Guard, like late game barbarian melee cavalry with shields, the type that specialize in anti-cavalry endeavors. They will beat these guys will beat them in melee combat, prolonged melee combat. And not just beat them by a little bit, but they'll slaughter them because of his 13 armor penetrating damage. It is just so lethal, but also combine that with 65 charge. You can't get a better charge than this on a cavalry unit, basically. I mean, maybe for something with like one more charge, but you basically can't. Like 65 is just the highest category of charge bonuses. These guys have 8 melee defense, which is better than the 6 that you get out of a companion cav, while maintaining the 15 melee attack. A lot of cataphracts don't have 15 melee attack. It's very common that they have like 10 or 12 just to compensate for the armor penetration, but these guys have the attack and the armor penetration, as well as 56 armor, which is crazy. I mean, this is just such a top shelf unit. Like, once you get these guys, if you're willing to commit to supporting them on the flanks with Threo spears and like whatever else you're gonna do, bring these guys. They're just such a deadly unit. And you have her worse than Parthian cataphracts. I'm not gonna say that they're not, but against any army that can't field cataphracts, these guys will clean house. Now, moving on to your melee infantry, you don't have very many good options. You have your typical Greek infantry, which every single Greek faction without exception has, and these guys suck. They have absolutely terrible armor. The 33 base morale is disgusting. Now, these guys can skirmish a little bit with 3 ammunition, but their lack of charge bonus kills their combat effectiveness. I mean, they'll get some kills, but they just tend to be very underwhelming and an overall liability in an army. Now, they can sometimes be useful if you kind of run them into enemy skirmishers, or you just use their javelins and just engage them in light combat. They can have some impact, but ultimately these guys don't have very much influence in the battlefield, but they are cheap. They are more or less a militia, just a Greek variation of a militia. Now, the Pharaoh Swordsmen, these are just your generic Pharaoh swords. There's some good Pharaoh swords in this game, like the Pergamese ones are kind of cool, the Athenian ones are kind of cool, but this one is trash. This one's just your normal one. Now, they do have 3 ammunition when it comes to skirmishing, and because your skirmish contingent is a little bit poor with the Seleucids, I would consider it somewhat useful to bring these guys. Like, instead of just having like archers or something, you could go for a couple of these just to kind of enhance the overall killing power of your army. Once these guys use up their ammunition, they are a somewhat useful or viable melee infantry. Like, I'm not saying that they're going to be great, but I'm saying that they're better than nothing. Like, if you wrap these guys around the flanks or something, they'll get some kills, or you can use them to like support your pikes in some way. So you might want to use them, but of course they're lackluster, as Pharaoh swords are. Cretan infantry I'll miss because they are a mercenary unit, but you also have Royal Peltas, and Royal Peltas are really good, and they're recruitable from the first turn theoretically, but you do need to get to like a level 3 barracks, so it will take you quite a bit of time to research what you you need to get these guys, but they are ultimately quite strong. 16 melee attack is superb, but 8 melee defense is a liability, and for such a high attack, low defense unit, for 18 charge bonus is only average. Now, what these guys are good at is, well, as the name suggests, they are peltists. They do have 3 ammunition, making them more or less an extremely powerful version of Freya's swords. They are just a top shelf version of Freya's swords, but you know what? You get some experience chaperones on these guys as you do as you recruit as the Seleucids, and you absolutely have a very, very, very powerful unit, particularly in early game. These guys will smash in early game because they are an elite sword that you can get a decent amount of. They do come from your first population, and like I mentioned before, it takes a while to recruit them, but they're useful. But also keep in mind that they're a little bit vulnerable. Their shields do not provide the best block chance. 30 armor is good, but it's also fallible. You know, most elite infantry has like 38 armor. 49 base morale is good, but also not the very best that it could be. It's only alright. So at the end of the day, these guys are good, but not great. But of course, they are very flexible. They have 4 speed as well. I didn't mention that. Like, for a unit with this combat stats, 4 speed is really, really crazy. So, these guys are more of a supportive unit. You don't want to have, like, your flanks completely overrun with these guys. That's like using Royal Peltis wrong. You maybe want to have 2 of these in your army at the very most. 1 on each flank, and they kind of support the other units on their flanks. They throw their javelins. They kind of cycle in and out of combat. Don't keep them in for too long because their armor's not great. And that's kind of how you get the most out of your Royal Peltis. They are ultimately skirmishers that engage in battle very, very competently, but keep in mind they are skirmishers. Now, moving on to your Silver Shield Swordsmen, these guys are unlocked with the phalanx, with, the 4-axe reforms, but you know what? 4-axe swordsmen, I mean, these are 4-axe swordsmen, by the way. They say Silver Shield Swordsmen, and it's said that you guys fight in the Roman style, but their statistics aren't Roman-esque. They have higher attack than melee defense. Like, the Syracusan heavy infantry is so much better than this one. I'm just saying, guys, it is. This unit's okay. I have tested them out offline, and to be honest with you, like, they're just alright. Like, they will lose in a late game engagement with the vast majority of infantry that come from factions that actually specialize in infantry. Now, these guys are better than the vast majority of late-game melee infantry that Greek factions can provide. There's only a couple examples that I can say are equivalent or better. Like, the Syracusan heavy swordsmen are better, but it's not like you're going to ever face Syracuse in your campaign as the Seleucids. Like, I'll be gone. The Pergamese swordsman is slightly better. They have the exact same combat stats, but 3 more armor, so the late, like, Pergamese bodyguard is slightly better, but very marginally. The Massilian Hellenic swordsman is kind of the same, maybe a tiny bit better or a tiny bit worse. It's hard to say. I didn't test the 2 against each other, but they're definitely in the same caliber. But outside of those very specific options, you're number 1. You're number 1. I think this is definitely, it's better than the Thesprotians. I know that for sure. Right, Thesprotians have weaker stats, I'm pretty sure. Although, no, Thesprotians exactly the same stats. I was wrong. Exactly the same stats as Thesprotians. The only difference is that you have formation. So in theory, your unit's kind of better, but not really. Yeah, the Thesprotians have the discipline trait, which is all you really need. So again, like, there's other Greek units that are like this, and you know what? Again, the Greeks don't dominate the melee infantry game, but it's nice that you do have an elite option. And moving on to your spear infantry, you have your Seleucid light hoplites. This is not an exceptional light hoplite. 10 armor is not the worst. There's some with 8 armor, but ultimately 10 is not very good either. Light hoplites are good on the flanks, but they come from your second population class. They're exclusively used in early game. In late game, these guys will be absolutely outclassed and cut the ribbons by nearly anything. But the reason why you use them on the flanks to support your men is because they have 4 movement speed, making them quite maneuverable and, you know, to push and pull a flank warfare. And of course, these guys have phenomenal damage versus cavalry, so that's kind of like the main thing. That's kind of like the main thing that you need to concern yourself with. Exceptional damage versus cavalry, so use these guys to deter enemy cavalry and push them off your flanks, as well as they can do decent in early game infantry warfare. They have better stats than the vast majority of early game infantry. So that's kind of the use of them. This is just a normal Freo spear that you have as a Seleucids. Exceptionally good unit for mid game, and considering your options here, unless you're going to use Royal Peltis, and honestly I don't only consider like one Royal Peltis on each flank, you probably want to have like 2 Freo spears on each flank. Just a great unit that'll help you keep your flanks nice and secure. Use these guys extensively. You don't have anything better, trust me. Now moving on to the 4X reforms, I already covered these Royal Guards, but I just kind of wanted to say that in terms of like what you're gonna bring in a late game army, I'd honestly say that you probably want to bring one of these guys on each flank. Like, we're just so bulky, and because your Silver Shields will lose in melee combat versus so many late game infantry units, these guys are just going to be really good at making sure that your flanks last and survive long enough for your phalanxes to do the killing work, because the phalanxes are going to be the main killing tool that the Seleucids have. Your phalanxes are unmatched, so yeah, you're definitely going to want to bring your 4-axe spear, because this is your killing power. This is your killing power. This is not your killing power. This is holding. This is surviving. Of course, there's some... I'm not saying that you're like the worst melee faction in late game. No, like Arabs and Parthians and stuff like that will still come at you with weaker. But, you know, Romans, barbarians, they'll crush. So yeah, I would keep maybe, like, ideally, like, your best late game army would probably have like 2 of these on each flank and 1 of these. And, you know, maybe 1 more unit to support max, but probably not. You want to invest more into cavalry and other things like that. Now, moving on to your phalanxes. This is, of course, the bread and butter of the Seleucid roster. This is your spear. This is basically the thing that's going to win you battles. But it's not going to be this. It's not going to be your Levy Hoplite. I guarantee that. This is just a generic, typical Levy Hoplite, absolute crap unit. Don't use these guys unless you're desperately trying to defend a minor settlement. And I've said that so many times in these guides, so I'm just going to move on. Seleucid Hoplites, this is a generic, regular Hoplite, which means that they're good in early game. Late game, they will be decisively outperformed by anything anybody brings, but in early game, they can of course have utility. Now, considering that your early game melee roster consists of these Seleucid Light Hoplites and these Greek infantry, as well as maybe some local levies, it might be useful to bring some Seleucid Hoplites. I mean, Hoplites are reasonably decent fighters outside of Hoplite formation. They have great armor, and when supported by, say, like crappy Greek infantry, these guys can actually keep their flanks nice and secure and do a good job. Now, your pikemen are absolutely superb, and pikemen in general are just superb tools of war, just exceptionally useful. So these are basically as good as pikes get, like generic pikes. Absolutely fabulous. Use them. Obviously, if you're playing a Seleucid campaign, expect to use pikes at every twist and turn. They are inevitably going to be the core of your army. It's not going to be hoplites. Like, why would a successor kingdom roll of hoplites? Like, pikemen are just better in almost every single possible way, particularly because you're going to have to fight so many successor kingdoms, like the Ptolemies, like Pergamon, like stuff like that. You know, hoplites are not going to be effective against those types of foes. So use these Greek bronze shield pikemen as the core of your army throughout most of the campaign. Now, moving on to your elite pikemen. And Seleucid elite pikemen are cool because they come from your second population class, just making them much easier to recruit than the vast majority of elite pikemen. Now, these guys have great stats. Great stats. Superior attack, superior defense, great weapon damage. The only thing that maybe makes these guys a little bit weaker is that they don't have great armor. They just maintained a standard 35 armor that is quite typical of elite pikemen. Now, you can see like over here, like the Chaonian Guard, they do better. They do better, and a lot of elite units do better, like into early game than these guys. Like we can even go to the Ptolemies and check out what their elite pikemen have. See over here the Egyptian royal pikemen who are available right from the onset. Like these guys, they have better stats. They have better melee attack and better melee defense, better weapon damage. But at the end of the day, this is not where the Silver Shield pikemen end. And again, like the main advantage of these guys is that they're really easy to recruit. You're not going to fight Egyptian armies that come with a crap load of royal pikemen, but Seleucids can have effectively an entire line of these guys, which is insane. So through sheer numbers, you're going to dominate the pike engagement by just having lots and lots of elite pikemen once you recruit these guys. And yeah, just make sure to bring them. They're expensive, but they will just allow you to win the pike tussle, which will, you know, make your melee infantry weakness less pronounced. Now, once you get 4-axe reforms, you get options that are better in like both the silver shield and the bronze shield variants. Your bronze shield pikemen basically end up getting the stats of silver shield pikemen once the 4-axe reforms hit, with the exception of a couple of things. They have higher armor but less morale. Your regular silver shields are still stronger than your 4-axe bronze shield pikes. I will be completely honest, because these guys have 3 speed, these guys have 2 speed. Also, I didn't mention the silver shields have 3 speed. I didn't even realize that. That's actually really cool. You know, having pikemen that are actually maneuverable is so refreshing, because most pikemen just move super slowly. So 3-speed pike is absolutely goated. But also, yeah, it's just a morale for armor type thing as well as speed. I still prefer the silver shields, but the thing is that once you hit 4-axe reform, you can't get regular silver shields. You're now getting silver shield 4-axe pikemen. Yeah, you basically have to wait the whole campaign to get like better versions of your elites, but it's so worth it because these guys are just incredible, man. These are the best pikes in the game, hands down. Like, I haven't found better entirely because of a 3 speed. Like, these Egyptian royals, they have less armor than your Seleucids. They also come from the first population class, mind you. They go to Epirus, who have amazing phalanxes too. This Chaonian Guard. Actually, the Chaonian Guard equivalent. Never mind. You know, I saw this before I made this video. I don't know why I said I didn't find anything better. But yeah, okay, the Chaonian Guard and their Silver Shield 4-axe pikemen are identically strong units. They're just amazing, amazing pikemen. These guys will absolutely dominate your campaign, dominate the phalanxes of your enemy. Don't worry, the Epirotes won't be around. They die in like turn 50 to the Romans unless you're playing them, so it doesn't really matter what the Epirotes have. But I'm just like theoretically, this is as strong as a pike can get, basically. So use them. Super duper strong. You know, I was curious, how are Spartan pikes? I forgot all about that. Spartan 4-axe pikemen, I mean, they're worse. They don't have the 12 attack and 14 melee defense. And their speed is 2. Never mind, Spartans are nothing special. Now moving on to your missile infantry. You don't have good missile infantry here, so I'm just going to breeze right by this. Generic Greek javelinmen, terrible unit. Never bring these guys. Horrible morale, no armor, no shields. These guys die immediately. Only useful in the desperate siege defense, otherwise don't bring them. Greek archers, generic archers, not the worst archers in the game, but far from the best. Not really all that good, and their low armor and low base morale means that they run quite quickly, but they can do good damage if nobody targets them. So that's kind of what you're hoping with the archers. But, you know, against a Parthian opponent, against a Persian opponent, against any Eastern opponent, you will be so thoroughly out-skirmished if you bring these guys, so beware. Now, your best skirmish unit, in my opinion, at least for like long range, comes in the form of these Greek slingers. They have 190 range and 11 missile damage, making them rather competent. Like, their base stats as a slinger are good, and they do have little shields, but the main issue is that they have a 1 armor, so these guys still die in spades when targeted by a good missile unit. So while these guys have more killing potential than the archers, they still are pretty squishy since they are just generic units. Now you also have your early Peltas and your regular Peltas. Now these guys, of course, are pretty dang solid. Like, they do double as infantry and semi-competent infantry, not like amazing infantry, but kind of like your Freya's swords. Like, they can go in combat and become part of your combat line, and they'll get some kills, albeit they won't light it up as infantry. It just, at the end of the day, like, these guys just aren't amazing. They are generic Peltas. There are far better Peltas in the game, the specialists that are offered to other factions, but clearly, you know, when you give the Seleucids decent melee infantry options for a Greek faction, amazing cavalry and amazing phalanxes, they have to suffer somewhere. And here it's going to be in the missile infantry. And considering this is your base roster, you should be pretty aware from the beginning that if you want good skirmishers, you're going to have to get area of recruitment units, and you're going to have to get mercenaries. Luckily, in Syria, you do have access from turn 1 to your very, very strong Syrian archer mercenary unit that has great range, better damage than a generic archer, and actually has armor. They are pretty expensive to maintain, but you know, if you're a skirmish fan and you want your phalanxes to not have to tread forward, you know, you like the luxury of just sitting back and having your archers force your opponent into your phalanxes, then yeah, just make sure to have your skirmishers from your mercenary pool. Now, I am just going to say this. I think I forgot the shield bearers. These guys, amazing hoplite. Well, I did cover them up here, so not a horrible blunder. I mean, ultimately, like, as the Seleucids, you have, like, the most easily recruitable elite pike in early game, the best elite pike in late game, and literally the best hoplite outside of Sparta right from the very beginning. So it's like, dude, like, you have amazing, brilliant units. So I really feel like you can kind of get whatever you want, but I wouldn't use hoplites as a main line, even if you have these guys in abundance. They come from your first population too, so you really don't want to recruit too many of them, but I feel like these guys are just going to be like a nice complement to like your flanks, you know what I mean? Like, they're just gonna be really good to have on your flanks to kind of support your melee infantry. But at the end of the day, once you get these 4x guard, I feel like these guys are kind of just like an updated version of these. Like, we're just gonna be better performers on the more loose combat on your flanks. So yeah, I'd probably get those in late game. Now, moving on to your shock cavalry, you just have so many great options. That's the thing about the Seleucids. You might not have the best of any cavalry unit in the game, to be honest, but you just have a supreme amount of options. And I'll show you guys what this means, right? So the Sarissa Lancers, this is just a great cheap option that offers you amazing utility. Like I mentioned, these guys have phenomenal charge bonus, making them amazing for hammer and anvil strikes, which makes them amazing for mopping up enemy skirmishers. Just overall, the type of cavalry that's just going to dart in and raise hell, but ultimately if they get stuck in melee combat with anything from an infantry unit to a cavalry unit, they will get crushed. So make sure you're not suicidally charging these guys in, but they can be pretty damn useful. Now, your light Furos cavalry, as the name suggests, they come with the Furos reforms. This is kind of like a hybrid Thracian style unit with a couple volleys of javelins, although nothing explicitly amazing. Decent charge bonus, the type that you'd expect on a citizen cavalry, yet these guys are much cheaper than a citizen cavalry. Yet where these guys suffer extensively is in the armor department. Like, these guys, they will be even better for killing skirmishers than these guys, but they also will be worse for the hammer and anvil. They also come with 90 men, I just have to make it out, so both of these men are kind of bulkier units, which, you know, when it comes to larger units, expect lower attack stats because they have more men, right? That's kind of the way it is, it's the only way to balance them out. So the fact that these guys are a little bit weak doesn't really mean a whole lot. Like, it probably balances out and makes them quite fair, and they are very cheap. Like, that's the main thing. I think that these guys also come from the third population, if I'm not mistaken. So that's actually a very important thing with these guys too. They're just really easy to get. Just overall a great unit when it comes to adding flexibility to your army, which is what a light cavalry unit is. It's just a great light cavalry unit. So within the genre, it makes sense. But if you want something with more killing potential, obviously don't get this unit, okay? If you want something like amazing, you just want like, you know, you're just trying to get like a top shelf cavalry unit, don't get these guys and think that it's it. But they're just really useful. They'll help you against enemy light troops, against enemy skirmishers. Will help you alleviate, you know, 50-50 cavalry fights because they're just so fast. You can get in there and pop a pretty good charge, stuff like that. Light cavalry is actually kind of nice. They have a medium mass, but they still have an 8 speed, which is really underrated. You know, I feel like these guys are just better than citizen cavalry. Like, they have worse stats, don't get me wrong, but they're more offensively minded. They have a better charge, making it better for hammer and anvil. And the armor difference is only like 5. The main thing citizen cavalry have over these guys is morale, but these guys are also cheaper. Like, in all honesty, I just feel like this is just a better version of citizen cavalry. So if you're looking for just like a medium cavalry, just a generic medium cavalry, you're looking for something stable but something that won't break the budget, this is your option. Now, Thessalian 4x cavalry, obviously available of the 4x reforms onward. Thessalian cavalry are basically just an elite, heavier version of Sarissa cavalry. They're mainly just meant for charging, but their capabilities in melee combat that's prolonged is not particularly good, so don't bring them for that. Moving on to your Taranti cavalry, every Greek faction has this, or nearly every Greek faction. So they are pretty decent because, you know, they have a good amount of utility to them. 8 speed, 4 ammunition, but considering their cost here relative to these, I would much rather just take Sarissa cavalry or light cavalry. Why pay more for what is basically just a unit that's kind of part skirmisher, part cavalry, melee cavalry unit? They're just not a particularly good unit for the price in the context of his roster. Just, you have so many good options. I would never get Tarentines. Moving on to your Seleucid citizen, I'm going to say the same thing here. This is a basic citizen cavalry. Nothing good about it, nothing bad about it. Citizen cavalry are the definition of mediocrity, but I'd much rather have a light cavalry. I'd much rather have a light Furrows cavalry. It is at the end of the day, get either your lowest tier cavalry because they're cheap and cost effective, or get your top tier cavalry because you're really good in combat. And starting with your top tier cavalry, you have your companion cavalry. This is a 4-axe cavalry on steroids because they have way more armor while maintaining the same speed, the same charge bonus. I think actually maybe even more. Actually, no, they're a little bit worse than charging. I lied, but they're a lot more stable, which is important. You know, you don't want a unit that's only good at hammer and anvil. You want something that can hammer and anvil while also fighting in combat. So these guys are just great. Who's ever talked crap about companions? Companions are just phenomenal cavalry in general. Now moving on to your next one, the Seleucid Politikoi cavalry. I mean, I think that these guys are basically just an upgraded citizen cavalry, and their statistics reflect that. They're more defensive than aggressive. They have, you know, a decent charge bonus, but not great, and same thing with armor. They kind of have like 38 armor. The thing is that these guys are like, they're okay. They're not amazing. There's nothing about this unit which really speaks amazing, and I know that this is like a late game unit as well. But the thing is that these guys are basically like just nobles on horses that are defending their lands. That's really what they are. I don't know. I just feel like this unit's kind of out of place. Like, its stats are very mediocre, so there's just nothing left to be desired here. But also, like, they're kind of just good for the price, I guess. Like, this also isn't the best, you know, shock cavalry unit, just like this isn't the best melee cavalry unit. They kind of play the same role as your companions, I guess. If you want something that just packs way more punch than your basic citizen, get these, because they are just way better objectively. The citizen will get like beat by anything elite, but these guys can actually start going toe-to-toe against elite cavalry. Nisians I'll just skip because they're an area of recruitment unit. And going on to your early Royal Guard cavalry, as I demonstrated in the campaign map, you can recruit these guys from turn 1 from Antioch. And they're just overall an absolutely phenomenal unit. 47 armor is cracked, 60 charge bonus, and the amazing 29 weapon damage is phenomenal. Just overall, this is such a good unit. Bring them in abundance. These guys can absolutely smash through almost any cavalry in the early game, and you'll just use them to teach your opponents a lesson. Great against cavalry, great on a hammer and anvil. Just overall, amazing, amazing cavalry. This is what you think of when you think of Alexander the Great's companions. Just a bunch of Macedonian nobles, bloodthirstily barreling into battle with no concern for their own health. Now moving on to your Greek companions, these guys are a late unit, like I mentioned here, so these guys are going to be recruitable with your 4-axe reforms, and these have the exact same stats as these, so you don't really have to go over them. And just in late game, you have the choice. Do you want a more flexible Macedonian-style cavalry or a cataphract? And it's really up to you to choose which one you favor. It really just depends who you're fighting. I feel like flexibility is better against, say, like the Parthians, because their cataphracts will be better. Speaking of that, you have your Hellenic cataphracts. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of the generic Hellenic cataphract. I'd say just bring your late Royal Guard cavalry, because you can recruit them. They're not, like, general only, so I just bring them because they're better in every way. They're more expensive, but this Hellenic cataphract's a little weak. Like, compared to Parthian cataphracts, they're pretty bad. Like, these guys will get crushed by Parthian cataphracts, so I would just bring your late Royal Guard cavalry, but these guys are just so overpowered, man. These guys are so good. Again, their low speed will kind of get them wrecked, but that's kind of the only negative of them. Otherwise, these guys will win in melee combat, they'll win on the charge. Absolute menace in every single regard, and just an amazing unit. Now, your missile cavalry, these two, they are negligible. Let's not even talk about them. They're horrible. Don't bring them. Now, you do have some kind of decisive, you know, battle-winning tools here. Your chariots, you know, I don't really like chariots in Divide et Impera, even though side chariots are deleted chariots that you'd bring if you're gonna bring chariots. It just ultimately, these guys kind of get stuck and quite easily destroyed, and that just makes them very, very, very vulnerable in combat, especially considering like how much you bring them for. At least we don't run amok like elephants do. However, I mean, they could either get you like 1,000 kills in a battle or get you close to no kills. It just depends upon how lucky you get and how exploitable the AI is. And I don't even feel good about taking advantage of the AI with like beasts of war, like elephants and chariots, just because of, you know, how dumb and predictable the AI can be sometimes. So use them if you want. Like, chariots really are just a all or nothing type unit. They're never just okay. Like, they're either really good or horrible. It just depends on how you use them. Now with your elephants, you have Indian elephants and Syrian war elephants. These two options, they represent the top shelf when it comes to elephants. Absolutely phenomenal units. The Indians are cheaper, but the Syrian armored elephants, they just have better stats and are more armored. And I actually did a comparison, and these are basically the best elephants in the game outside of the ones that the Marians recruit, the actual Indian faction from which the Seleucids got their elephants. So ultimately, very, very good elephant unit. Get these guys if you can. They're just so good. But yeah, my verdict, guys. The Seleucids are a very, very powerful faction. That's undeniable. Between their phalanxes and their cavalry, they represent really, truly what a good Hellenistic faction has. And also, their infantry is very good for a Hellenistic faction. I wouldn't say it's a #1 melee infantry Hellenistic faction, but it's still excellent. Better than the Macedonians, anyway. Yet, these guys have the same phalanxes that the Macedonians have, pretty much. The only weakness is missile infantry. And of course, melee infantry is an objective weakness of the Hellenic factions, so I'm going to say that a little bit too. So because of those two, I'm going to give them a 9.5 out of 10. It's not perfection when it comes to a faction, but it absolutely is a very powerful faction. Now, when it comes to how much you should play this campaign, it's a 10 out of 10. I mean, you're holding onto the heartland of Alexander's empire. You start out with one of the most unique start positions. You have your own secessionist rebellion scenario to play out, and you get to try to crush Parthia when it's still rising. There's so many unique things to play with when it comes to the Seleucid storyline that you just absolutely need to try this faction. Now, I would put a very specific caveat, though, that these guys are not a particularly noob-friendly faction. If you're a new player, don't try these guys. It is such a frustrating start position if you don't understand the mechanics of Divide et Impera well. So that's kind of a problem. Now, for my last point, it comes to the difficulty of this campaign, I would say it's a 5 out of 10. If you use the start position well, you absolutely can get ahead. You absolutely can screw it up too and get bogged down. It's really just a matter of, like, how good you are at dealing with the complexity of the start position, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a very hard campaign. Plus, your roster has so much potential that there is that. So 5 out of 10 for me. But anyway, guys, that's it when it comes to Seleucids. I mean, we've done all the Hellenic factions now, the Hellenistic factions, and the Balkan factions too. So it's now time to move into barbarian territory and check out the Gauls. So stay tuned for that, for things are about to get quite hairy and rabid of our Gallic faction guides. But that's it for now, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.